All right, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Johnny Cornegay, and I am the Mobilization Director for the Counter Narrative Project. And I would like to welcome you to our webinar where we really do explore the question, how do we take care of each other? I am quite honored to have joining us L. Michael Gipson, who will be sharing with us a really innovative solution that we'll get a chance to talk about a little bit during this particular webinar. As for our agenda today, we are going to start with a little bit of webinar guidance. I want to make sure that everyone who's joining us understands how the process will work. We will talk about the mission of the Counter Narrative Project. I will get a chance to introduce L. Michael Gipson, and then we will have a presentation from him. And we will have time for some Q&A and a brief closing. So as for webinar guidance, this is very important. So all participants will be in listen-only mode for the duration of the webinar. That does not mean you cannot ask questions though. So the way to ask a question is on your screen. There is a Q&A button. So please use the Q&A button on your screen. There will be a box there that you can put your question into and it will come over to us. And then towards the end of the webinar, we will go ahead and answer some of those questions. So as things come up, please feel free to put those questions inside of that Q&A box. And once we get to the Q&A portion, we will pull questions and make sure that we ask your question to get a response from Michael. Thank you. So the mission of the Counter Narrative Project is to build power among Black gay men and to work in coalition and solidarity with all movements committed to racial and social justice. You can find us online at our website at thecounternarrative.org. And you can also find us all over social media. So on Instagram, we are at The Counter Narrative. On Facebook, we're at Counter Narrative Project. And on Twitter, we're at Building Desire. If you go to thecounternarrativeproject.org and click on the Join Us button, you can join our mailing list. Once you join our mailing list, that is the most effective way for you to get information about what's upcoming for the Counter Narrative Project. And I highly encourage you to go ahead and to join the mailing list. Thank you. We do have some upcoming webinars that we would love for you to attend. As with this webinar, which is part of our Now We Think webinar series, we are going to have a webinar next Thursday, so that's March 5th, hosted by me. And we are going to talk about house music and HIV movement history. So if you have not done so, please go ahead and RSVP for that webinar. And then the following week, we are going to have a webinar with Dennis Hardy. Dennis is going to talk about PrEP, community power, and sexual justice, and that is going to be on Thursday, March 12th. So if you visit thecounternarrative.org/events, you can RSVP for the upcoming webinars, and we would love to have you. So please make sure that you go ahead and do that. So now that all of our housekeeping is done, I get the opportunity to introduce our amazing presenter today. L. Michael Gipson is a writer, educator, and 25-year advocate for a range of social justice causes. L. Michael Gipson, MS, is the founder and principal of Faith Walk LLC, the Urban Rights Project, the Black Bear Brotherhood of Detroit, and co-founder of the Black Alphabet Film Festival in Chicago. Mr. Gipson previously served as Deputy Director at Equality Michigan, Executive Director for the Washington Area Lawyers for the Arts, and is the co-founder of the Beyond Identities Community Center, the first LGBTQ youth of color drop-in center in Ohio. In 2017, he launched the Black Bear Brotherhood of Detroit as a social collective for Black, gay, bi, SGL, and GNC men of size and their allies, which has since expanded to chapters in Seattle and Cincinnati and Washington, D.C. And editor at large at soultreks.com, Gipson is a Red Dirt Press author and lead writer and co-producer of the docuseries Indie Soul Journeys, which is coming up really soon. So without further ado, I would like to turn everything over to L. Michael Gipson. Michael, can we hear you?
Yes, you can. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming to our Black Bear Brotherhood Self-Care Salon, a case study. This is a community approach for Black men's healing, and I'm delighted to be able to present our model to you. Slide. So our goal for today is to increase your knowledge of grassroots, community-based, community-led models for self-interrogation and healing among Black gay men in our community. And Black Bear Brotherhood, because of who we are, we have brothers who encompass a wide swath of sexualities and sexual identities within the queer spectrum. And so we want to make sure we honor that in the naming. For participants to have been presented a case study of a therapeutic community-based model of Black men supporting one another. So we so often hear about how Black men don't care about each other, don't take care of each other, are not each other's keeper. And so this is a model that describes Black men actively trying to figure out how to do a different thing, right? To help brothers address their trauma, stress, and mental health concerns. Slide. So who are we? Who are Black Bear Brotherhood? So I want to give you a context for the community that began this model and how it came to be. Slide. So we were founded 3 years ago, come this May, here in Detroit, and it started as a potluck. Actually, the first one was actually a barbecue, and it was so successful. We had 12 brothers who showed up and talked about how much they needed a space like this for men of size, a space that affirmed Black gay men who may have aged out of the clubs, maybe even in maturity, if not in age, and wanted a different way to connect. And the ways in which we connected, to me, felt like the ways Black gay men had always connected, me having come out in 1991, before technology and internet and apps began to dictate what community looked like. Within Black Bear Brotherhood, we were doing what had been done in my youth, in-person community with each other, building relationships with one another in person, and establishing soul ties in that way. So Black Bear Brotherhood, our mission evolved into having a mission and values and principles, but our mission is as a social collective committed to fostering the social connectivity, health, wellness, political, creative, and financial well-being of Black, gay, bisexual, gender nonconforming, and same-gender loving men of size and their allies. And our values, Black Bear Brotherhood believes Black men loving and caring for the health, freedoms, and well-being of other Black men is a revolutionary act. It is a fraternal, loving, supportive, empathetic, and compassionate act that members of this collective make a commitment to realize for one another and the communities we belong to as an explicit responsibility to our brotherhood, families, friends, and community. Black Bear Brotherhood further believes in the centering, representation, and celebration of men of size as critical, valuable, and necessary. So that's who we are, and that kind of helped inform our need to have this self-care salon as a model. Like, how do we put our mission, our values, our principles? We have 10 principles that, and several of those principles speak to taking care of oneself first so that you can be accountable and responsible to community, to family, to your brothers. But without that first step, putting that mask on yourself first, the rest is less possible or less effective. And so it became really critical for us to want to do that. As had already been pointed out, Black Bear Brotherhood has 4 chapters, and Detroit is still the hub. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. You're good, Johnny. So why self-care salons? For those who may not be familiar, the salon is an old way in which communities were formed. You know, in the Black tradition, there is a Harlem Renaissance tradition of having salons for what was then referred to as the niggerati. Cultural creators, content creators, we would call them now, of the Harlem Renaissance, who got together to debate ideas, to talk, to share libations and food, and debate and discuss the issues of the day, and also to encourage and inspire one another as creatives. And so we borrow from that tradition in our framing of the salon and using self-care in this way. So like we say here, it's a struggle question in search of an answer. This model was also born out of a need to innovate and a need to come up with something new, because we have limited resources. And often when Black folks have limited resources, they have to improvise. And we are no different in that regard. We knew that brothers needed support and didn't always have the resources to access support. Slide. So how do we know that brothers needed this support? Well, in December 2018, we administered a survey of our membership to date, or at that time. At that point, I think we have something like 100 members who had signed on for the Detroit chapter alone. And we surveyed them to find out, what did they want from us? What did they need from us as an organization? And this came up in 2 ways, the answers, the responses. So questions related to how did Black Bear Brotherhood help you over the course of the year? A lot of the brothers talked about how it helped to reduce their isolation. It helped them to confront their anxiety. It helped them to have a better ideation of themselves as a man of size, as a gay man, as a Black man, that the group helped them form a more positive opinion of Black gay men. And it said, how do questions related to how you can help, how can Black Bear Brotherhood help you be a better man, right? So, and the topics that they would want to see to help improve themselves and their personal development goals. And so repeatedly as themes, these issues came up, that a lot of the brothers were suffering from depression, anxiety, that even though the potluck provided some relief from the isolation, the potlucks only happen once a month. And so, you know, the rest of the time they were still kind of grappling with senses, a feeling of isolation, which is interesting because, you know, I think a lot of techies believe that the internet with the social media apps and all of that would have alleviated or eliminated the sense of isolation. But for some people, it's only deepened it. And we saw that in the outcome data. Mistrust, there is a mistrust that has been cultivated among Black men of each other, regardless of sexuality. Compound that with sexual orientation, and you'll see that there's lots of prevailing mistrust of gay men in general and Black gay men in particular. And so, and that they wanted to address that they wanted to and needed to trust their brothers. And so how do we get to that? The other thing was PTSD. Some of the brothers had more serious traumas that they had experienced in their lives. I mean, on some level, to be Black and a man in America, certainly to be Black and gay man or a queer man in America, is to have some trauma, right? To have been experiencing some form of historical trauma, be it through blood memory or through personal lived experience. And so there was some brothers who were dealing with PTSD. There were some brothers who were dealing with deeper, more serious diagnoses. And so, part of it is also recognizing what we as an organization can and cannot provide. But just to know that so many of the brothers were experiencing these concerns called out for a remedy, or at least an effort at a remedy. Slide. So this is a case study of how we attempted to approach these issues, and the solution that we initially tried and the solutions that have kind of evolved as a result of our attempt. Make sure I'm seeing some questions come up. Yes. So that everybody is muted, and that the questions, the Q&A, it will be presented at the end. Yes, absolutely, Timon. Slide. So some barriers. So whenever you're trying to present or deal with the mental health aspect in our community, lots of us grew up in traditions that are skeptical of what therapy can bring, whether or not it's necessary, whether or not it's for Black people, whether or not therapeutic approaches that aren't rooted in spirituality are effective or necessary. And so a lot of our brothers come out of those traditions and are resistant to kind of formal mental health mechanisms and vehicles. So those are things that automatically, you have to address up front. Those attitudes are changing. As you see, like in podcasts like The Read, they talk a lot about mental health. There's another podcast with Dustin actually a Black gay man from Chicago from Detroit called The Friend Zone, and they are addressing mental health and wellness at every episode. And so you're starting to see those attitudes change, particularly among the younger generation. But Black Bear Brotherhood brothers go as young as 29, well, actually more recently 22, we got some youngins lately, to as old as 60. And so, there's lots of generational differences in feelings and beliefs and how much we shared and what we were raised that was appropriate to share in a public setting that are also rooted in our culture. No one on Black Bear Brotherhood's board or membership was a licensed clinician when we started. And so we didn't have like a volunteer that we could go to and say, hey, could you donate a couple of hours a month to helping run a group? That kind of thing just was not available to us. And when we reached out and we, kind of did some research on the lay of the land here in Detroit, Detroit is not LA, it's not Atlanta, it's not New York, it's not Houston. We have some of the top universities in our area. University of Michigan is here. Wayne State is here. There's great universities throughout Michigan, but they tend to be places where people come and they get their degrees and then they leave to go to the hot city. And what that has left Rust Belt cities and southern areas and rural areas with is a glut of really qualified, culturally appropriate, culturally competent, either Black LGBTQ or friendly licensed behavioral therapists or clinicians in the area. And the handful that are here, people may know Kofi, who's here, is a Black lesbian woman who's been an amazing therapist and healer for the area. They're booked. Everybody needs to get in, right? Like people who are willing to go, they're booked or they're retired. We had a brother Floyd who'd been doing this work for a long time. He had other family obligations. He'd retired young. And most of the people who were retiring in their 50s, and sometimes not. It's maybe 60, right? Like they were not usual retirement ages, but they had been so burned out and so exhausted by the sheer volume of people coming with need that it left very little left on the bench for us to pull from. And then of course there's also just people who are just not that good. And you only get really one shot at Black men or Black gay men and convincing them or having a conversation with them about their mental health. And if you do it wrong the first time out the gate, you generally, they aren't that forgiving and willing to try you again. So we want to make sure that, you know, whoever we worked with was going to get it right from the start. And we're a grassroots organization. You know, our budget for a year is like less than $10,000. And so we are a group that has been founded, you know, out of the pockets of founders of different chapters and out of members willing to contribute and support the growth as well. Counter Narrative Project has also seeded us with some resources that has allowed us to expand and grow over the last 3 years. But we don't have deep pockets. And so being able to fund a full-time clinician to help address these matters isn't where we are at this point in our development. And that may be true for others of you on the call. Slide. Yeah. So, so initial strategies and solutions. So when we first started, we ended up finding a retired clinician, Dr. Jerome Gibbs, who's also a Black gay man and also a man of size and elder. And he was very excited about what we're trying to do. And he was willing to work with us on an hourly rate. Still a pricey hourly rate, more than I've ever made per hour. But you know, he was willing to work with us. And so since we're only going to do it once a month, you know, based on our member dues or based on the monies we were getting from mini grants, we could afford to support, you know, once a month, 2 hours a month. But that also meant that we were increasing the role of this facilitator. And I ended up serving as the facilitator, you know, because I do have some training in basic counseling techniques, attending, motivational interviewing, that kind of thing, from having worked in the HIV/AIDS field. And so, you know, we had reduced responsibilities for a clinician, increased responsibilities for a facilitator, to be more the lead, the facilitator, co-facilitator. The clinician was there to correct, there to provide clinical level support for people who may need it, who may have been triggered in the room by a topic or a conversation piece, people who may have broken down and may have needed a clinician. And so we wanted to make sure that that presence was in the room, even if we weren't relying on it for content. And they would be willing to like review the decks and information that we were going to provide through educational sessions to ensure that it was, you know, medically accurate information. We labeled the session Self-Care Salon and Discussion Group instead of Support Group, in recognition of the fact that mental health language can be off-putting for some segments of Black men. And we did it because as initially, before our clinician saw his attorney, he was under the impression that as long as it was called a discussion group and not a support group, that it didn't matter that he was retired, right? Like, and so he could be in the room and have, you know, had this therapeutic background. And, but, you know, since we're having this as a discussion group and he's just in the room and he also is reflective of the membership and our mission, et cetera, and as a member, and had joined as a member, we would be able to utilize him. That was our initial belief. And then limited seating. So our potlucks can easily get to like 40, 45 people. You know, our community level events, like 50, 60 people. So for this, we definitely wanted to make sure that we did not have large groups, that this was going to be a limited seating engagement. You know, we would max it out at 15 tops, which was how many could fit in my living room comfortably. And and so and that was, you know, was also a consideration, like, you know, it was happening in my home, it was happening in the living room space, which would also help to ease people's comfort if they were walking to an office building or a conference room. I think that gets people's backs up, right? And so it kind of assumes in certain things, particularly if you like have people sitting in a circle in chairs. So we want to make sure that that wasn't a feel, that it was kind of a home based, comfortable, you know, warm setting in which discussion could happen and flourish, you know, very similar to the salons of the Harlem Renaissance. Slide. So the model. So as I've already said, it was 2 hours. It was deck-based, so, you know, there were slides that provided educational information about the topic. So it meant some research had to be done by me as a facilitator. It was facilitator-led discussion group. You know, the facilitator, if you're going to use this model, should be a trusted member of the group. You can hire an outside person for greater objectivity, but then that person also has a greater role to hold in order to get to trust. You know, it's not necessarily, particularly in a setting where people are aware that they're going to be talking about difficult subjects. You know, the skepticism, you know, is already going to be high. But because people knew me and comfortable with me and respected me and my leadership, you know, some of those barriers were already alleviated. Up front, everyone commits to a set of shared behavioral agreements or rules of engagement in the room, as we call them. Just, you know, essentially ground rules. The topics that the group discussed were all topics that have been brought to bear in the survey. So none of them were topics that we created wholesale. They were things that the community had asked for. So we were giving people what they wanted. So topics range from things like how to heal or move on from past trauma, how to navigate the world as a person of size in a slim fit world. So those kinds of topics that people had asked for, we delivered. People were informed up front that full participation was expected and that this was a working session, and that meaning that everybody was expected to do work. This was not passive in the way that our potlucks are passive, where you get to choose how much you engage or not, how much you participate or not. People understood that this was a roll up your sleeve type of experience. People were also encouraged to leave the room without permission if they needed to take care of themselves, either emotionally or just, you know, have to use the restroom. So, you know, we grown, we don't have to ask permission, just go. There in my home, there are plenty of breakout rooms, so if people needed to go and take a phone call or something that was an emergency, they could just go and do so without disrupting the rest of the group. People were also encouraged to utilize the counselor in a breakout room as needed. So if you had been triggered by a particular conversation or exercise or workshop point, you could then go and talk to the clinician privately, and you could do so in the middle of the group. Like if you need to just take that person out, which is again why we relied on the co-facilitator model, so that, you know, and relied more heavily on the facilitator to lead as opposed to the clinician, because so that way the clinician was free and flexible to be able to move in and out of the group as necessary. You know, some counseling techniques such as attending, which, you know, involves things such as active listening, reflecting back, mirroring back to people things that they were saying, and required full engagement, modeling empathy. So how we wanted people to talk and how we wanted people to approach these questions and conversation, the facilitator was required to model, so that people understood boundaries, people understood language that was inoffensive and affirming, and that people were understood to expect the interrogative inquiry framing. So, you know, people would like state something that they had happened to them, or an experience that they had had, and their point of view on that experience. And, we would do maybe the Charles Stevens model of, well, what would it look like if, so what would it look like if you did this, if it had gone this way? Or had you considered the possibility of the person experiencing that, who had responded to you in this way might have been experiencing X? What other things might have been going on at the time that was impacting or influencing the experience you were having? So we still, we're respectful of people's stories and people's point of view about those stories. But some of the times the tapes that people were playing, the stories that people had told themselves, was very much like, they were toxic and very, very tunnel vision, right? I think this is the best way to describe it. Like it didn't consider what else might have been informing that, like, and what people's capacities were. So, if someone had disappointed them, or somebody had let them down, or someone just did not love them in the way that they needed to be loved, or cared for them in the way they needed to be cared for, to consider what was that other person experiencing as challenges, what was the other person's personal limitations and capacities, what had that person been taught, what had that person been modeled. Particularly when we talk about families, a lot of times people were looking and expecting things from relatives and friends that it was clear from the description of the person that the person would never be able to deliver those things. They just did not have the capacity to do those things. And helping people to, not necessarily like look at it as a way to forgive them, but oftentimes helping them to work through or explain for them what possibilities might have been happening, to get them to see another point of view, to get them to lens it in a way that might help facilitate their healing. And we encourage radical candor. Now, when we say radical candor, though, we were very clear to say that radical candor does not mean attacking people. Radical candor and offering toxic feedback. Radical candor did not mean, even if you found someone to be invested in a pity party that grated you or got on your nerves, or, got in your claw, when you would hear it because you knew that it wasn't the whole story, or that way of lensing wasn't going to ultimately be helpful in facilitating healing. You weren't encouraged to then give tough love, because oftentimes tough love is just coarse language that's excused, right? And so, but wanting to be loving even in our challenging. And so that was, people were encouraged to do that. And again, a facilitator was modeling that to show people what that looked like so that they would know what the boundary lines were. We have a question around, has the line of radical candor ever been crossed? How was that resolved? Sure. Yeah, that would be crossed. I think for the most part, people were tentative. I think, in a room where everybody is struggling and walking into the door in recognition that they're struggling with something, or need help or need support around an issue, I found that people tended to be, for the most part, pretty ginger with each other. If anything, they might have erred too much on the side of, or I don't want to say anything that might piss them off, or I don't want to say anything, but yeah, I think that it depends on the people in the room, and we'll talk about it in the next slide. Reading the room is really critical, and recognizing upfront who the people are that you may need to manage. That might mean doing things like physically standing next to that person that you need to manage, and touching their shoulder when they're going a bit too far, and reminding people of the rules of engagement, reminding people of what feedback is supposed to look like that's not toxic. And so sometimes you would have to do that, and or sometimes you would have to interrupt and say, well, that's one way of viewing it. Let's consider this other way, right? So that you can redirect the conversation quickly away from the fault lines that was going to lead to something, more explosive. So yeah, that was definitely happened. All right, going to the next slide. So I know I really can't stress this enough. Like we weren't in a cold clinical space. We're in a home. There's something about being in people's homes or warm setting. And maybe you can recreate this in like an office environment if you're operating out of an office. I've seen it done. Agencies that I've worked for in the past. We used to have something called PS Cafe, which was Positively Sexual Cafe, which for people living with HIV, being kind of offered a nightclub setting to be able to go out and meet people and date in an environment where they didn't have to worry about their status being an issue. And so, for the self-care salon, we definitely have warm lights, soft ambiance. When people first hit the door, the music is chill, vibey, relaxed. It's not aggressive. It's not a lot of cursing. We want to get people to relax. And we know Black people are sensory people, right? And so we want to make sure that we're helping the touch points, particularly since one of the key rules is that people can't come inebriated, right? Like you can't come drunk, and you can't drink or smoke, blunts, whatever. We have marijuana is legal here in Michigan for recreational use. But for that particular space, people were asked to be sober, or if they had a drink before they got there, not be drunk. But they weren't allowed to be high or get high in the space itself. And this was an important distinction because, the potlucks, people drink, people may have edibles, so this space was a different space. This was not the space for that. And so there was, clear lines of distinction. And, if, people would make a little noise at first. Oh, if I got to talk about this, I'm gonna need a drink. But for the most part, people understood the rules, and we're like, after the session is over, if you want to hang out afterwards and have a drink with somebody here, you're more than welcome to do that, but not beforehand. We want people engaged in a sober and clean and lucid way. We also encourage, obviously I statements, affirming language, empathetic language. And that happened, both from a facilitator, but also it was encouraged across. So sometimes you would have sessions where you would literally give people language to use with each other. For people like on the trauma session, we definitely encourage everyone who had a partner to say to the other person, and it was like part of a mantra, like, I'm sorry that this happened to you. You did not deserve the things that have happened to you. No one does. And even though, that may feel cliche, or it may feel like, well, of course, some of the people in the room had never heard those words, right? Like if they had been sexually violated, or if their mom had been, or parent had been abusive, in ways, if people had treated them unlovingly, there is a sense that people in the community may blame them. Like, well, what did you do to get hit? What did you do to put yourself in a position to be raped? What did you do to have your parent be aggressive with you? Like there's that language that you oftentimes hear, especially like on social media and stuff, that's toxic, and people feed that into their own personal narratives. And so we wanted to make sure that if never any other place in their life that had been said to them, that in this space with other Black men, that they got loved on and affirmed and received empathy and grace about their circumstance. Okay. All right. So that was a huge part of it as well. I've just been given a note about how much longer I have, so I'm gonna be quicker. We also made sure that people got permission before touching. So, at the end of all of our self-care salons, with consent of people were invited to hug one another, to just touch, again, without sexual response or sexuality or sex being in a mix. Some brothers had not experienced Black gay men in any other context but a sexual one. And so how do we begin to, say, hey, there's other ways we can touch each other and it not be sexual? Because we all have skin hunger and want to be touched. But for those who were not interested in being touched, they had the right to say no. And in those instances, they were given like words. The person was given words to say to that person, so that that person could still be affirmed and loved on in the space without touch. And we also wanted to make sure that even if we didn't agree, even if we felt like people were not telling themselves the whole truth or not being entirely honest in what they shared, that we weren't here to discount people and their experience as they understood it, even if we were going to engage in some radical, some investigative inquiry, some interrogative inquiry in some of the places where we felt like the questioning wasn't going to yield to a healthier experience. And we did encourage people to use the feedback sandwich, which is something I borrowed from my creative writing life and teaching creative writing, which is, as the person's talking, identify the things that you want to address or critique, but also identify the things that you liked or the things that you appreciated. And so you might have started with a little bit of a critique, then you would talk about the things that you liked and the things that, you found that was revealing of resilience or strength or, some other positive factor. And then go and talk a little bit more about the critique, right? And so that it wasn't all negative, that, even if, and which required people to listen more closely to identify those things so that they wouldn't be caught flat-footed when it came time for feedback. So that was part of it. Slide. So these were the lessons learned. Slide. So one of the things we found out was that we could not keep Dr. Gibbs because he talked to his lawyer and found out that even though we were a discussion group, even though he was not there in a formal role of his clinician, that because he'd been licensed, because he'd had this training, and because he had taken certain oaths, that he was still vulnerable to a malpractice lawsuit from someone in the room, right? And so members of the self-care salon was very quick to say they would gladly sign a waiver. And so, if that was all that was required in order for him to be present. And then there was also a question of, well, whether or not, since we are fiscally sponsored by another nonprofit who has mental health supports, are we covered under their insurance? So those kind of questions are still being kind of worked through and have not been fully resolved. So what we did do was just simply, went without the clinician for the next session that we did. The clinician ended up not, even though he was present and he was there specifically to address triggers. I don't know if it was because of the space in the room. I don't know if it was because of the way that the room was set up, and how people were taught how to be loving and working with each other through their stuff. But at no point ever did anyone leave the room to go deal with their issue in the moment. No one got triggered to the point that they didn't want to be in the space. Or needed to talk to the clinician privately. Now, we stopped after a few sessions, about 4 sessions, just because we had other things on our calendar that took over our work. So maybe it would have happened in the future, but in the ones that we did and with the people that we worked with, it never came up. So that's not to say it's not needed. I still think you have to be mindful of people being triggered, but maybe that person doesn't have to be a clinician. Maybe it's just somebody who's been trained to be a good listener and, some of the basic counseling techniques that we discussed. We would cut it off at 12. Make sure that you have an even number. I think that was one of the things that we definitely learned, was that you want people to be able to have partners in the sessions, and you want people to have a partner that they don't know, right? So we required that if you came with your best friend, or you came with your lover, or you came with your husband, like that couldn't be your partner for the session. Like, partially because you were going to give that person what that you wanted that person to hear or see or feel about you, right? Like that you weren't going to always be honest. There were some things, maybe conversations you may not have had yet with your partner, your boyfriend, or your best friend. And you weren't ready to have it yet with that person one-on-one, right? And so the breaking up of people into dyads and triads throughout the sessions was a way to ensure that everyone spoke, so everyone participated. You were forced to because you had a partner. And you had to report out your partner's stuff. So you didn't even have to, the person didn't report out their own stuff. Your partner had to, which forced people to listen. And so all of that led to more transparency and people being more willing to share. Now, of course, there's some people who are the type who's like, oh, I'm not telling anything to a stranger. But I was actually pleasantly surprised that some people were willing to share with a stranger that they had not actually shared yet with their friends yet. And that was a note from the clinician. The clinician had recommended that. Be observant, read the room. Like if the agenda is if that you have isn't working, don't be afraid to deviate. If you have to skip a couple of slide deck on your deck, if things aren't going in the way that they want them to go, do a check-in with the room. And remember that the room doesn't know what you have planned. Only you do. So they don't know what they don't know. They don't know if you're skipping stuff. They don't know if you decided to go a different direction because you read the room and you realize, oh, that's not going to work with this room. So do that. Prepare. So we use outside material. For these topics, you want to have a pretty good sense of the issues and what you want to say. Like we use Roxane Gay's Hunger because Roxane Gay writes, if you've not read the work, it's a memoir, and Roxane Gay is a Black queer woman who talks very candidly and about how her weight and her body issues were rooted in trauma and were rooted in the fact that she had been raped as a 12-year-old. And she talked about all the different ways it hurt to be in her body that are very mundane, like just walking down the street, sometimes, being out of breath, showering, like it was the little stuff that people of size don't discuss publicly. And so like to be able to read out loud, hey, this is somebody else having this experience. You're not alone in this experience, beyond just the people in the room, beyond just the facilitators, that this is an issue that is being dealt with in the public sphere, was helpful. Trust the knowledge in the room. Don't expect to be the only expert in the room, and don't treat the room in that way. Earn the trust in the room by respecting their knowledge and providing personal examples and anecdotes where possible. Like if you're asking people, and this is actually counter to what social workers are trained to do, particularly in facilitation. But if, as a facilitator in this space, if you're asking people to be transparent, then they want to hear a little transparency from the facilitator too. And, for people who are formally trained in education, we don't do that. We definitely, in social workers, they don't do that either. But in this kind of a space where you're asking people to be naked pretty quickly, it helps to share a little bit of your stuff. It helps to share a little bit of your experience, not to that it dominates and you become the session, but enough that people realize that you're not judging them and that you are similarly circumstanced. Slide. So this is what to deal with some of the changes. We're going deeper in our community-based approach. So we're launching the Care Bear Project this May. For volunteers who are interested. So like for those of you who grew up in a church tradition, you may have experienced Good Samaritans, the people who went to the sick and shed-ins, the people who, was required to go and bring the casserole or the flowers, or if somebody lost somebody, go and sit with that person. So that kind of church model, a lot of our brothers, this is Detroit, this is a very Black church experience group of men, want to have that among ourselves. And so those brothers will be trained, though. I was like, I don't want people going to sit with somebody who just lost their brother or their mother and saying platitudes or saying the wrong thing or saying things that's going to set people off. Like, so we're we're getting people LGBT mental health first aid in May. They're going to go through a training. They're also going to get motivational interviewing and attending training so that they can have some basic skills, while also recognizing and reinforcing often that they are not therapists, they are not counselors in that way, but they are being invested as community healers and community supporters. And so, you know, and we want to normalize therapeutic seeking behaviors among Black men. So we just got a car for a new brother who is a licensed clinician. We're vetting him now to see whether or not he can work. We want to be able to refer people to someone who, if they have more serious need beyond what we can offer, that they can access that. And we're encouraging people within our group to model more grace and empathy. We're going to be more explicit about stating our mission and values at the beginning of potlucks, asking people to read off principles, to just reinforce like why we're there, like and what we're about. And we've even encouraged somebody to develop a mantra for us so that that can be part of what people are telling themselves when they're dealing with dark spaces as well. And lastly, we're encouraging BBB members to create meetups this fall as we go into the seasonal depression season in the winter here is pretty intense for a lot of brothers. A lot of brothers had a rough time this year. And we did have a community level event that spoke to that in February. We're gonna encourage people to set up meetups, to go have bowling nights, to have movie nights, to do more in-person things with each other that isn't necessarily officially a Black Bear Brotherhood organized, paid for event, but just amongst themselves to help people get out of the house and to help people deal with their isolation. So those are things that we're moving forward with, as well as the self-care salon. So slide. Questions?
Yes. So hey everybody, you can see me now. Thank you so much for that presentation, Michael. And before, I do have a couple of questions for you, but for folks who are joining us, if you do have a question, please go ahead and put that in the Q&A box and we will work to get that question answered live. So thank you for those folks who have been able to join. So Michael, my question for you, one just came up as you were kind of doing the last slide too. But my first question, earlier on, so Black Bear Brotherhood, y'all decided to do a membership survey. And what I find so interesting about that is I think there's kind of this running narrative, right? That it is hard to get Black gay men to complete a survey. Like, that's not something that we do. I'm curious to know how you were able to encourage members to complete the survey so that you can get that feedback.
It is hard. That's not a myth. You know, we're currently struggling. We struggled with that for our 2020 survey that we did this year. You know, well, we did the online pushes and our social media pushes, but what we ultimately ended up doing, and I didn't want to do it this way, was at the next potluck, we just like told people to go in the room and fill out the survey. Go one at a time. And like, had you fill out a survey, you fill out a survey, go in the room, fill out the survey, go on the computer, fill it out. So, you know, because we could have gone hand, but then somebody would have to input all that data. That would take forever. You know, we needed people to be on the computer and just fill out the Google form, which automatically generates, you know, that synthesizes the data for you, like, right? And we didn't want to have to deal with that extra step. So, we did end up having to use the potluck as a way to get people to do survey.
Okay. Excellent. Thank you so much for that. And my kind of follow-up question to that. So one of the things that you talked a lot about is people being able to feel comfortable kind of in this room, making sure that it was in an environment that they felt like they could speak freely, etc. What is some feedback that you have gotten anecdotally from members about their experience participating in the Self-Care Salon series?
Surprise. Some brothers had brought up that they thought they had healed from things and then realized that they hadn't.
Mm.
That came up a lot. You know, like people was like, I thought I had dealt with this, but now I'm listening to myself and I'm listening to the responses and how you're saying things back to me that I'm saying, and in a way that's like, oh, that is what that sounds like. Oh, that's crazy. Or, you know, like, yeah, I guess I am still, you know, I have not fully healed or fully recovered from that. I think one of the things is also realizing where people are. You know, I hate to go like trans theoretical stages of change kind of thing, but when possible, as a facilitator, like being able to stage like, oh, this person is not yet ready to act on this, right? Like they're still in contemplation or they're still in planning, but they're not in action, right? And being encouraging and supportive that, okay, where you are right now, it's okay to be there. Like healing is a process. Like this whole idea of self-care or self-love as this destination that you get to, and that once you're there forever, is not something that we subscribe to. And that was a regular conversation piece. Like self-care and loving yourself is a constant act. It is it's a roller coaster more than it is a straight line. There are days in which you aren't going to feel it. There's days in which you're not going to love yourself. We can tell you we can give you some books, we can give you the workshop, we can give you some brothers tell you beautiful. And there are going to be days when you look at your body and you're not going to love it. Like it's period. And that's okay. You know, and I think also theoretically we reject the notion that, oh, people, if they don't love themselves, then they don't love anybody else. You know, we've heard this mantra time and again. It's RuPaul's, probably most popular mantra. But, the reality is that most of us grew up in households, not most of us, many of us grew up in households where we saw a mother who took care of her kids and got up every day and demonstrated incredible love and compassion and support for her children in a way that she never did for herself. Or fathers who was always present and taking care of business for their son, but not behaving lovingly towards themselves or about their bodies or their health, or, like we know people who demonstrate love for themselves, who love other people greatly. And so recognizing the humanity of that and encouraging people to offer themselves forgiveness, to offer themselves grace, to interrogate defense mechanisms. This was on one of the slides, I didn't unpack it. There are defense mechanisms Black gay men have developed to survive and to cope with issues.
Thank you.
That were absolutely incredible and necessary when they were younger, that are now serving as destructive forces in their lives. But it worked for them, right? Like it serviced them, like they recognized that it helped them to survive. So to let go of it is really difficult, right? Like this thing helped me get here. It helped me to be present. And to be able to say to them, it absolutely did. And thank God it did that for you during that period. It is no longer serving that for you today. And how do we begin to come up with some new coping mechanisms and strategies that are more helpful, that are healthier? And I think that's been a huge part of it too.
I'm going to close us out with, you said something and I've never heard it presented in this way, but I want to spend a moment talking about it. And it's this idea of soul ties, like developing soul ties with people. And I found, first of all, the wording of that and what it invokes for me is extremely powerful and and just like this way of connecting that's just deeper than the superficial, right? It's developing these ties to our brothers and the people that are in our lives by our souls connecting with one another. And I wanted to unpack that a little bit, this idea of developing a soul tie with folks.
Well, I think that oftentimes you know, when we hear of soul ties, we think of romanticism or romantic language around this. And the truth of it is, many of us will have deeper, longer, more successful friendships than we will romantic relationships. And so I have soul ties with me. You know, we call each other brother. You know, I have relationships with men, Black gay men who've been in my life for over 20 years, who've helped pay for college, who've helped help define my values and my principles, have chastised me when I needed it. You know, that's a different level than a kiki buddy you're gonna hang out with in the club or go to a movie with just for a key and have a you know, that can be part of that relationship too. But the person that you can completely cry on their shoulder and do the ugly, nasty Viola Davis cry, that's not going to be everybody. That's going to be the person whose soul you trust to take care of your soul. And so how do you develop? But I think that a lot of people that I've encountered have not had those kind of relationships, but they also don't necessarily have the skills to have those kind of relationships, because those kind of relationships require you to be as vulnerable, for you to be as accountable, for you to be as available and present as the person. Like they can't do all of the work. The soul tie works both ways. It's a tie, you know, so you have to help tie the knot. And so, but people have to do the work, and that work takes time, and it's slow, and it's deliberate, and it's intentional. And it's not as easy as, like, you know, being Facebook friends.
Right. Wow. Michael, I want to thank you so much for everybody who is with us. You can email Michael Gipson at faithwalkllc@gmail.com if you'd like to learn more about the Self-Care Salon series. Michael, thank you so much for providing us with some amazing insight. And I feel like ways that folks who watch this can employ this in their everyday lives in the communities right where they are, to help to get us through some of the things that we often experience. So thank you so much for this presentation.
Thank you all.
You're welcome. Bye, everybody. Have a great day.
Bye.